A short history of resistance to innovation. History is often written as a victory lap for human ingenuity, but every leap forward has been met by a desperate attempt to pull the handbrake. This technophobia stems from a deeply human fear of losing control, status, or the very essence of what makes us human. From the written word to artificial intelligence, the narrative of progress is inseparable from the narrative of its opposition. Ironically, the first great technological threat was the alphabet. In his dialogue Phaedrus, Plato recounts Socrates' grievance against writing. Socrates feared that relying on external symbols would atrophy the memory, creating the appearance of wisdom without the reality. He believed that true knowledge lived in the soul through oral dialectic, and that books were merely reminders that would make men forgetful. Centuries later, as the printing press democratized knowledge, the focus of fear shifted from the mind to the spirit. The Church's opposition to early modern science, most famously the heliocentric models of Copernicus and Galileo, wasn't just a spat over math. It was a defense of a worldview. If the earth wasn't the center of the universe, the literal interpretation of the Bible was at risk. The fear was that by explaining the how of creation, science would render the who irrelevant. Moreover, the extraordinary claims of religion, such as the virgin birth or the resurrection, were suddenly under the microscope of natural law. If the universe was a closed system governed by immutable physical laws, then miracles were not just divine interventions, they were scientific impossibilities. This forced a retreat of the God of the gaps, where every new discovery of a natural mechanism seemed to shrink the territory of the divine. When coffee first arrived in Europe and the Middle East, it was met with fierce resistance from various authorities who feared its stimulating effects encouraged radical political thought. It was called the devil's drink by some clergy representatives. In 16th century Mecca, it was banned because it supposedly incited unorthodox behavior. In 1674, the women's petition against coffee in London claimed it made men talk too much and waste their time in coffee houses instead of working. King Charles II tried to ban coffee houses entirely in 1675, labeling them places where disaffected persons spread rumors. The public outcry was so loud, he had to withdraw the proclamation within 11 days. As we entered the industrial era, opposition to technological advancements became visceral. In 19th century Britain, the Locomotive Acts, the Red Flag Acts, required a man to walk 60 yards ahead of any self-propelled vehicle waving a red flag. It was a literal attempt to force the speed of the future to match the pace of a walking man. Simultaneously, the Luddites, textile workers losing their livelihoods to steam looms, took to smashing machines. Their opposition wasn't just to technology, but to the erosion of human craftsmanship. As one Luddite declaration from 1812 stated, "We will never lay down our arms until the House of Commons passes an act to put down all machinery hurtful to commonality." In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Enlightenment's focus on reason sparked the Romantic movement. Figures like Mary Shelley, through Frankenstein, warned that scientific hubris would create monsters. Romantics championed feeling over fact and nature over the machine. This romantic rejection of objective science eventually fed into the 20th century's most brutal ideology of Nazism. Nazi blood and soil, Blut und Boden ideology was a perverted form of romanticism. It rejected universal scientific values in favor of Aryan science, Deutsche Physik, prioritizing a mystical belief in racial purity over the decadent modern city and the liberal order they claimed was created by Jews. Another pernicious anti-Enlightenment ideology, fiercely fighting its progress-inducing ideas, is Marxism. Marxism, self-identified as scientific socialism, yet it often functioned as a secular religion with the following elements: the proletariat as the chosen people, destined to redeem humanity; the classless society as paradise, an end state of history where conflict ceases; the scriptures, Das Kapital, became a text that was to be interpreted, not questioned; heresy, disagreement wasn't seen as a difference of opinion, but as false consciousness or counter-revolutionary betrayal. While the Enlightenment championed the individual, Marxism prioritized class. This shift fundamentally changed the approach to traditional liberties. Democracy, dismissed as bourgeois democracy, a sham designed to keep the ruling class in power. Rule of law, viewed as a tool for the elite to protect private property, replaced by socialist legality, the interests of the party. Freedom of speech, seen as a liberal luxury that allowed for the spread of harmful, reactionary ideologies. Free market, defined as inherently exploitative, MCM, replaced by central planning, which required an autocratic state to enforce. The transition from theory to autocracy usually happened at the point of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In Enlightenment thought, power is checked by balances. In Marxist-Leninist practice, because the party claimed to possess the scientific truth of history, any check on their power was seen as a check on progress itself. This moral certainty provided the justification for dismantling the rule of law and suppressing dissent. While it shared a superficial care for the poor with Christianity, it diverged sharply through its violent disdain for the rich and its materialistic rejection of the soul. In practice, this science was often subverted by Lysenkoism, the rejection of Mendelian genetics as bourgeois. This ideological war on biological reality led to massive crop failures and starvation, proving that when ideology masquerades as science, the results are catastrophic. Later, as the 20th century dawned, the radio was feared as a distraction from family reading. The television was labeled the idiot box, and the early computer was viewed as a cold tool that would replace human intuition. The tension between progress and preservation reached a fever pitch in mid-20th century agriculture. This conflict pitted doomsayers who predicted a planet-wide collapse due to overpopulation against wizards like Norman Borlaug. Opposition to agricultural advancement stems from Malthusianism. In the late 18th century, Thomas Malthus argued that human population grows exponentially while food production grows only linearly. This pessimism saw a revival in the 1960s with Paul Ehrlich, who predicted in The Population Bomb, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." Borlaug proved him wrong. By developing high-yield, disease-resistant wheat, he saved over 1 billion lives. Another example is golden rice, engineered in the 1990s to produce beta-carotene to combat vitamin A deficiency, which causes blindness in hundreds of thousands of children annually. Anti-GMO groups spent decades using the precautionary principle to block its deployment, arguing that we didn't know the 100-year impact on the environment. Despite being proven safe by over 150 Nobel laureates and dozens of health organizations, it took nearly 20 years to get approval in countries like the Philippines. Critics argue this absurd opposition cost millions of lives and sites while the technology sat ready in a lab. Yet, the late 20th century saw a resurgence of this doomsaying in the anti-GMO movement. Critics, frequently in wealthy nations, often ignore the humanitarian stakes of tools like golden rice, labeling them frankenfoods, based on a romanticized view of pure nature. The return to nature argument is a luxury afforded only by the very civilization it seeks to disparage. It is easy to romanticize the wild when you are viewing it through a double-paned window with a full stomach and a medicine cabinet nearby. But pure nature is not a spa retreat. It is a relentless struggle for survival defined by hunger, exposure, and the brutal indifference of the food chain. To advocate for a total reversal of progress is to advocate for the return of preventable plagues, the end of the intellectual light provided by electricity, and a life that, stripped of the roofs over our heads and the laws that protect us, becomes exactly what our ancestors fought for millennia to escape: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The late 20th century introduced a new target: nuclear energy. Born from the shadow of the Hiroshima bombings, the anti-nuclear movement often conflated civilian power with weaponry. Despite being one of the cleanest energy sources, accidents like Chernobyl, exacerbated by Soviet ideological failures, fueled a narrative that some knowledge is too dangerous for humanity. This sentiment has evolved into the modern degrowth movement. Proponents argue that infinite economic growth on a finite planet is a physical impossibility. Their arguments include the resource ceiling and a push for simplification, viewing industrial progress as a death cult. If you offered a degrowth supporter $500, the purchase price of their refrigerator, to never use a refrigerator again for the rest of their life, they would almost certainly say no. The refrigerator is, in fact, a triumph of efficiency. Modern ones use a fraction of the power they did in the 1970s. Once a technology becomes a baseline for survival in a modern society, where we no longer shop for fresh food daily or live next to a farm, it stops being a luxury and becomes a necessity. Modern essentials are incredibly undervalued by the market. We pay for the metal and labor, but we benefit from the entire history of thermodynamics and electrical engineering. Giving that up for a one-time $500 payment is a losing trade by any calculation. Today, we face a new Socratic moment with artificial intelligence. Modern neo-Luddism has emerged. While the original Luddites smashed looms to protect manual labor, today's critics use legal challenges and poisoning algorithms to protest data scraping. This current legal battle mirrors the 1800s. Artists argue AI models steal their intellectual labor, while proponents see a tool for augmented creativity, much like the camera was once feared by painters. The persistence of these fears suggests they are hardwired to loss aversion. We value what we have more than what we might gain. The status quo bias, an innate preference for the current state of affairs. The uncanny valley and moral disgust, a visceral reaction against things that blur the line between the natural and the artificial. The most pernicious force in modern European governance is loss aversion. Over the last few decades, this has manifested as a culture of total protection, where the primary goal is to shield everyone from every conceivable risk through gargantuan regulation. The sheer volume of red tape is staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1990 and 2023, the EU generated roughly 540,000 pages of regulations, averaging 1,200 regulations per year. This regulatory burden is approximately 3 times heavier than that of the US federal system. For a business, this acts as a massive productivity tax. diverting vital resources away from R&D and into bloated compliance departments, effectively stifling innovation and economic growth. While idealistic environmental regulations aim for a cleaner future, the execution, marked by high CO2 taxes and rigid penalties, has driven EU energy costs to nearly 3 times those of the US. Tedious procedures and high overheads have created a counterproductive reality. European consumers increasingly purchase goods imported from China. Ironically, China remains the world's largest CO2 emitter, accounting for roughly 1/3 of global emissions, while maintaining significantly lower employment and consumer protection standards. By over-regulating at home, the EU is not eliminating carbon, it is simply outsourcing it. The attempt to protect consumers through information overload has backfired. We have traded clarity for an army of lawyers, consultants, and IT teams tasked with inserting 1,000-page terms and conditions, privacy policies, and information sheets into every customer journey. Studies indicate that over 90% of consumers accept terms without reading them. A classic study by McDonald and Craner estimated that if an average person actually read every privacy policy they encountered, it would cost them 76 workdays per year. The result isn't an educated consumer. It's a frustrated one who blindly clicks "accept all" just to make the pop-ups disappear. Perhaps the most visible casualty of this regulation-first mindset is the European automotive industry. By forcing a rigid, regulated transition to electric vehicles, EVs, the EU is dismantling its own jewel in the crown. Instead of allowing market-led innovation to drive the shift, these mandates have handed a massive competitive advantage to Chinese producers who benefit from a more vertical supply chain and lower regulatory hurdles. The bottom line: using regulation as a primary tool for problem-solving is the most effective way to stifle the very innovation that, given the right incentives, would actually solve these problems. Our history follows a predictable cycle. In antiquity, we feared writing. In the Renaissance, we feared a sun-centered universe. In the Industrial Age, we feared the car. In the Green Revolution, doomsayers predicted famine. In the Atomic Age, we feared the power of the sun. We try to identify and secure ourselves against every imaginable risk, however improbable, by regulations which stifle innovation and give the upper hand to autocratic countries which care much less about the standards we cherish. Today, with AI, we face the fear of losing our agency. History suggests this tool will not destroy us, but will instead become the new floor upon which we build the next level of civilization. New ideas always create new problems, but we can't let caution become a cage. What we fear most often becomes our defining legacy. We need to stop playing safe. We can't win the future without the courage to risk it.